Hello everyone, Dr. Christine Smith here, back for a really awesome session today with a guest named Kiran Krishnan. He's actually been on my channel before, and he's a microbiologist for Microbiome Labs. And we have had such an interesting conversation about gut health and brain health and how they all relate to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and try to invite him on here. And sometimes Instagram gives me a little bit.
Hey,
Oh, excellent. Perfect. We got that to
I'm
work.
doing well. How
Hi,
are
how
you?
are you, Kiran? I am good, thank you. I was just kind of telling everybody about you and that you are kind of one of the top researchers for Microbiome Labs and also a microbiologist yourself, and that you just have this amazing way of describing gut health and brain health and how they relate and the synergistic nature of them and the ecosystem of our gut. And we've talked before, but I wanted to bring you back because I've had
Yeah,
so many questions, and that was by far one of the most popular talks that I've
it
gotten to
is
have on
my
my channel.
pleasure.
So
Thank you
thanks
so
for
much for
joining me
having me.
today.
So relevant. It was really great to be able to be on here last time, and I know we covered a decent amount, but there's so much more to cover. So great to be on.
There is, and oh, well, I was going to say, and you were just on that really cool summit
Yes,
about
yes. Oh, and
microbes
then
and
I
mental
should
health.
say,
So
I think I mentioned this to you in our messaging. I spent a lot of last week in Ireland. So the APC, which is one of the top microbiome research institutes in the world, is doing a lot of the work on gut-brain axis and the role of the microbiome. They've developed a lot of the strains that we work with, and there's a lot of really amazing research going on. So I spent a couple of days with the absolute top researchers there, the ones that are most published in Nature Medicine, JAMA, and all that. These guys are the tip of the spear on understanding the gut-brain axis and the role of the microbiome. So it's been really exciting to be there, and so there's more information to share.
awesome. Well, I always have like my own kinds of questions, but let's just start there. Like, what was one of the
Yeah,
coolest things you
absolutely.
learned when you were talking to
Here's
them?
a really interesting aspect of all of this. With probiotics in general, because they're doing a lot of work with probiotic strains, right? And when we think gut-brain axis, one of the therapeutic tools we think about are probiotics. Um, the vast majority of strains that they have tested are loud strains, not silent strains, right? So I'll qualify what I mean by that. When it comes to gut-brain axis, all of it is driven through inflammation, just like we know with most of the chronic illnesses. It's a lot of all of it is driven through inflammation, and there's particular types of inflammatory cascades that drive gut-brain dysfunction that lead to long-term neurodegeneration, and then also short-term things like stress and anxiety and mood disorders and sleep disorders and so on. Right? The pathologies are the same; they're all inflammation-driven. And when you look at the inflammation, it really boils down to a few things. It's the elevation of things like interferons. So interferon TNF, which is tumor necrosis factor, interleukin 6, interleukin 12, and then a reduction of certain anti-inflammatory interleukins like interleukin 10. And then there's other repairing interleukins like interleukin 22 that come down as well, right? So there's a shift in how your immune system is continuously responding to the world around you. Most things are driving the inflammatory responses that I talked about. And then one of the key things that happens when you set up that type of inflammatory pathways or pathology is that tryptophan metabolism gets skewed in your central nervous system, right? So what starts to happen is in your central nervous system and in the periphery as well, tryptophan starts getting converted into something called kynurenine and quinolinic acid instead of serotonin and melatonin, right? We know serotonin and melatonin are neuroprotective, they're important, they're a happy hormone, helps you sleep, anti-inflammatory, all that good stuff. Now tryptophan is being made into kynurenine and quinolinic acid. Those are neurotoxic compounds, right? They drive inflammation, they drive anxiety, mood response, all kinds of neurological changes, and then long-term neurological degeneration as well. So that inflammatory pathology shifts tryptophan metabolism, and that becomes the fundamental basis for people who not only suffer from cognitive issues like mood, like anxiety, sleeplessness, all of that, depression, all the way to major depressive disorders, sickness behaviors, all of those things, But it also becomes a foundation of gut disturbances because it's exactly the thing that happens in IBS, right? IBS we now know to be a neurological disorder rather than a primary GI disorder, right? So one of the things, coming back to what is your probiotic loud or silent? What they started to find is that when they tested a lot of probiotic strains, many of these probiotic strains actually amplify the inflammatory response. They increase IL-6, they increase TNF alpha, they increase interferon gamma. They don't increase interferon lambda, which is a separate thing I could talk about later. But the reason they do that is because probiotics, most probiotic strains, are designed to irritate or stimulate the immune system, right? And the first phase of immune response is going to be upregulating these inflammatory cascades, which then turns on T cells and B cells and all that. In a healthy individual, right, who's perfectly normal, doesn't have any of these cognitive dysfunctions, doesn't have anxiety, stress, mood disorders, and so on, that can be a good thing for kind of upregulating and training their immune system, right? That's how you keep them active. That's the exercise the immune system needs. It actually can make things worse and certainly at the least not help anything, right? So when you're screening strains for this really important gut-brain function, and then even just for general anti-inflammatory function, or general inflammatory cases, what you really need is a strain that does not at all elevate any of those inflammatory cytokines. In fact, it should elevate the anti-inflammatory cytokines like IL-10, IL-22, interferon lambda, and so on, right? So that is a really interesting thing because they checked about, off the top of my head, about 18, 19 different bifidobacteria strains that are, and bifido is known to be, positively associated with health. There's lots of bifido strains used as probiotics. They found that out of all of them, only 2 strains that they checked out of the 18 and 19 had an anti-inflammatory effect. The other ones all had varying degrees of inflammatory effects, right? So it's just, to me, I was shocked at how much inflammatory response the probiotic bacteria created, which means that if as a doctor, or just an educated consumer, if you're out there and oh my God, my gut-brain axis, I want to deal with it, I'm going to use a probiotic, and you just start buying things and using probiotics, they could be actually making things worse.
I love that you brought that up because I think it's a really important thing that not a lot of people know. And it doesn't mean that probiotics are bad. It means that it's about timing and type and the status of your body. And I just saw somebody say, like, well, what about, how probiotics can cause bloating? If your probiotic is causing you bloating, it might not be the right type for you at the right time for where your body's at. And I work with a lot of sensitive clients, and if someone is starting to have like weird autoimmune reactions, they're already in an inflamed state. And so that is a person where I'm like, okay, we may need to work on decreasing the inflammation in your body first before we start introducing probiotics, because people forget the way the probiotics work is they're technically a killing agent. They kill off bad bacteria and take their place. So when you take a probiotic, it's like hiring soldiers. If your battlefield is totally scorched, being your gut lining, then those soldiers are not going to have the resources that they need, and it's also just going to like damage the battlefield more. So sometimes we have to focus on replenishing the battlefield and then using certain strains and certain types based on your body and where it's at, which is why the research that you guys are doing is so important. And like, I love that we just dove into the more complex physiology of it, because I can talk all day about like the stuff that causes leaky gut. And for anybody who's less familiar with this, he and I did another live like this a while back, and you can watch that for some of the more basic fundamentals. But I wanted to bring him on to talk about more of the complexities of the physiology, because so few people actually know and understand this. And there's such a role between the inflammation that you might already be experiencing and then the inflammation that can get induced by kind of doing care or treatment in the wrong order and too fast. And then that can also lead to disruption in brain health and inflammation. And then when he's talking about the mental effects of it, there are so many new papers and theories coming out that like depression and anxiety and mood disorders actually have a huge relationship to inflammation in the brain. So all of the inflammatory markers he was talking about, that is exactly the things that are playing a role in that. So I'd love if we could kind of talk about that more, and maybe we could some of the things, like we know the basic things that cause leaky gut, like bad diet, not over stressing, toxin exposure, but maybe some of the things that people don't always consider. And then I know you're
Yeah.
particularly good at describing like endotoxemia and what that
Yeah,
is like.
and to give
So I'd
people a
love to
little
dive into that.
perspective on like the structural element that's happening in the lining of their gut, right? And where this leaky gut actually starts to come from and stem from, then it starts giving you an idea of like, okay, what are the things I need to do to ensure that this structural element is sound? So you've got the intestinal lining, which is made up of one cell thick soldier cells, I call them, sitting next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, right? So they're just there. That's it. It's one cell thick barrier. Now, there's a purpose for that because if it's much more than one cell thick, it also becomes really hard to bring in nutrients and things that actually have to get through to the circulation, which is on the other side of it, right? The digestive tract is a hole that's open on both ends. So your mouth and your anus, it's two ends that are open. So the misnomer is that if you swallow something, it's actually in your body. It's technically not in your body yet because your digestive tract is a tube that's open on both ends. What is technically inside your body is when it goes through the lining of your digestive tract, whether it's in your stomach, your small intestine, or large intestine, right? It has to get through that lining and into circulation, then it's technically in the body. So what does that lining look like? Well, in general, and it's a little bit different between the small and large intestine, but here's generally how it's structured. You've got a mucosal layer, so this kind of thick layer of mucus, right? And then sitting below that is the soldier cells. So the soldier cells have the mucus sitting on top of them to try to help protect them because they need a barrier that slows things down, allows for things to be manipulated, judged, metabolized before it hits the soldier cells. Because when it gets to the soldier cells, it's going to go one of two ways, really. It's going to go through the cell, which is called the transcellular pathway, or it's going to go in between them, which is called the paracellular pathway, right? So in between them is the bigger space. So small molecules like your calciums and magnesiums and these things can just go right through the cell. The bigger things, the bigger nutrients and all that have to go in between the cell, which means that the cells have to be able to open up and then close back up again, right? Now, how does that function? Well, in between these two cells, there are almost 40 different proteins that are called the tight junctions that open and close the cell deliberately to allow things in and then shut it back down when we don't want things to flow through. Keep in mind that the vast majority of microbes in your body live just a few millimeters above this in the top part of that mucosal layer, right? So you've got trillions of organisms, and then virtually everything you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis, from food, drink, breathing things in, all of that ends up in this top layer just a few millimeters above the soldier cell. So they need to be very, very active in understanding what to let in, what not to let in, and they need to stay shut most of the time because they don't want things flowing through like bacterial byproducts, toxins, environmental toxins, and so on. So that structural element is really important. The tight junctions are between the cells and that mucus layer, right? Now you can trace back the vast majority of chronic illnesses to a disruption in one or both of those structures, right? A disruption in the mucus layer and a disruption in the tight junction proteins is basically at the root cause of the vast majority of chronic illnesses, right? And it's mind-boggling when you think about that. And the reason is, and when you boil it down, it becomes simple to understand. And the reason is because when you lose this mucus layer or you lose a significant portion of it and you start losing the control between these cells, you get lots of stuff that leaks through that shouldn't be getting into your circulation, ends up in circulation, and your immune cells go crazy trying to control all of that because your immune cells is freaking out that you're going to have massive amounts of microbes and viruses and all that leaking into your body, right? They're doing their
They're
job,
just
right? That's what they're
doing their
supposed to
job.
do, right? They are in this space right below this soldier cells called the lamina propria, where they're always monitoring what's happening because they're always watching for a huge slough of trillions of organisms coming through. So they're on guard. And then you start having a dismantling of the mucosa, which is a physical structure. So you have more things moving closer and closer to the top of the soldier cell. And then if you start getting the tight junctions dismantling, these are proteins in between there, right? You start getting huge number of things leaking through. The immune system that's down here freaks out and starts amping up all of this inflammatory pathways. And then you start having what they call chronic low-grade inflammation, right? And that's the biggest source of chronic low-grade inflammation. In fact, a 2015 publication in the Frontiers of Immunology showed that this dismantling of the mucosa and the tight junctions and the translocating of toxins and bacterial byproducts and all that into circulation was the #1 cause of death, mortality and morbidity worldwide. Right? It's the biggest driver of mortality and morbidity worldwide. And I would say 90% of people watching and listening probably have some degree of dismantling of this, right? Also keep in mind, your intestinal tract is really long, right? You've got 27, 28 feet or something like that when you count the small and large intestine. This could be happening in a 6-inch section of your bowel, or it could be happening in a 16-foot section of your bowel, right? And that is what determines how severe your symptoms are. You could be 18, eating crap all the time, going out drinking, not sleeping, and feeling fine, right? And that's because this is only happening around 6 to 10 inches of your gut, and your gut is healthy enough where it's being able to repair it fast, the damage. But when you become 40 or 35 or 50, it starts becoming 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet of your gut. Then it starts becoming clinically much more significant, right? But it's been happening that whole time. So that's just to give people a background on how all of this looks. So when you think about leakiness in the gut, then the biggest thing that happens first is a loss of that mucosal layer. Here's the really interesting, weird thing about that mucosal layer. As I mentioned, the vast majority of microbes are living in there, right? You have 30, 40 trillion microbes in your gut living in that mucosal layer. Many of those microbes can actually break down and metabolize the mucosal layer. It's actually really good microbial food. It's basically protein and sugar. And then there's water all around, right? There's all this moisture in there. So the microbes can go and they can eat that away all the time. So then the question becomes, well, why aren't they always just eating it down and it's not non-existent? Well, because there's lots of microbes whose job it is to rebuild that mucosal structure, right? So the moment you end up with an imbalance of microbes that eat away at the mucin structure versus rebuild it, you start getting a net reduction in your mucin structure over time, right? And that is what we call dysbiosis. So when you drive that imbalance between microbes that eat away versus microbes that rebuild, that's when you start to get the pathology of leaky gut happening. So how do you do that? A single course of antibiotics could have started that cascade, right? You could have had lots of years of eating Cheerios, for example. Cheerios have, right, really high levels of glyphosate in it, right?
Oh,
And
yes.
glyphosate is a real kick in the pants because glyphosate is an antimicrobial, but it's the worst kind because it selectively kills good bacteria. Right, a lot of your pathobiome. So pathobiome are the microbes that live in your gut that are potential pathogens, right? We all have them, but they tend to be under control if you're healthy because a lot of your good organisms kind of control them. But if your good organisms get eaten away, the pathobiome can expand and explode, right? And so if you've been eating that for years and you're getting all that glyphosate in, your pathobiome is going to expand over time, right? And then other things like stress and the induction of cortisol. Cortisol creates tremendous amount of leakiness in the gut, and then it also ends up amplifying the virulence factors in pathobiome. So if you have organisms that could potentially be pathogenic in your gut, a lot of them are sitting there quietly waiting till your cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine levels are elevated. They're trying to sense your level of stress in the body. They know that when the host is stressed, the host's immune system is suppressed. So that's a good time for them to start turning on their party, right? So they're sitting around just waiting. And every time you have a big bout of stress, these guys go, hey, this is time to party. Let's multiply. Let's metabolize. Let's do what we do and produce the toxins, right? So then multiple bouts of stress over years creates a significant amount of dysbiosis. Another thing is lack of exposure to beneficial bacteria, right? We are designed to be in a constant osmosis with the environment, right? We are a byproduct of evolution from the environment itself, right? As mammals, we've actually very luckily or smartly incorporated a huge amount of microbes into our system. And those microbes conduct all these kinds of amazing functions for us. And so the moment we started divorcing ourselves from nature, meaning we spend the vast majority of our time in sterile and relatively sterile environments, we don't go out into dirt anymore. We're not eating dirt. We're not exposing ourselves to natural microbes. That has a measurable impact on our microbiome over time, and less and provides less diversity in the gut microbiome, right? And then finally, the diversity of our food as well, and there's other reasons, but if you think about our ancestors ate upwards of 600 different types of foods annually, right? They were foragers, gatherers, hunters. They ate all kinds of things. They ate seasonally. They could only eat what they had at the time. They fermented lots of stuff to preserve it, so they increased the microbial load and the biodiversity of the food by doing those things. So, our system is used to seeing a huge variety of things coming in. The microbes are designed to be able to metabolize and break down a huge variety of macronutrients. But when you bring in a small variety of macronutrients, it only favors certain groups of microbes. Others don't get to really have a good time and break down all the food that they've been waiting for, right? So if you add a lot of those things up together, what you basically end up having is this low level of diversity in the gut microbiome. When you have low level of diversity, those pathobiomes get to expand. And those pathobiomes are driving this reduction of the mucus layer, and they're driving the risk of leakiness in the gut, right? So that's kind of just a basic physiology of what's happening. And you can see, if you understand the standard American diet, the standard American behavior, right, why we are in the place that we're in right now.
Oh my gosh, I love when you just like lay down the knowledge like that. That was awesome. So I want
Yeah.
to just review like a little bit for anybody, because that was a lot of incredible knowledge. So basically he was kind of talking about all the different things that can contribute to leaky gut. I
Yes.
think stress is one of the most misunderstood contributors to leaky gut for all the reasons that you're just saying. And I love that you addressed the the microbes that
Yeah.
literally have receptor sites for adrenaline and norepinephrine. And so it's like they literally are fostered by our stress hormones, which is why I'm such a big advocate of teaching mindfulness and meditation and things like that, because yes, it's good in a number of ways, but also we live in an environment where we're just so overstimulated that it induces a stress state. Like even just driving on the highway, like we're not really designed to go hurtling through space at 60 to 80 miles an hour every day. And that is a stressful thing when it's like you're driving and you're constantly like guarding on if anyone in the four corners around you is going to accidentally kill you. Like that is a stress state. And so when we start living in that state all the time, and then we're also at work and we're worried about that project, and we have 1,600 emails in our inbox and the 78 texts we have to get back to, it's like all of those things by themselves seem very small, but they add up over time to living in this stress state. And times where we go like meditate, or we take time to be quiet, or to go be in nature, this is how we start to re-regulate our neurochemistry, because there's this like really weird cycle in the gut that we'll get to next about how stress can induce dysbiosis in the gut, and then that dysbiosis in the gut leads to leaky gut and endotoxemia, which then induces more stress in the brain because it affects your mental processes, your ability to make decisions, and your feeling of overwhelm. And so I saw someone question earlier, like, can a long-term state of leaky gut cause things like low alkaline
Yep.
phosphatase? Sure, it can, but there's other things that can also contribute to that. But alkaline phosphatase can also be related to like zinc levels, and it can mean that you have a low zinc level. And zinc carnosine is incredibly important for healing the gut lining, and zinc is a huge part of our immune system. So there's a whole component of that.
Yep.
That's a broad answer. And then I wanted to go back to the glyphosate thing, because I think a lot of people don't realize, okay, so glyphosate is Roundup, for anyone who doesn't know that term. Roundup is how our crops here in America are harvested, is usually with our grains. This is why we struggle so much with grains in the US. Not only are they like
Yep.
modified in a lot of ways, but they are basically sprayed with Roundup, which is poison, before they're harvested, because it preserves farm equipment and it makes for a higher yield of the grain. And the way that glyphosate works in an insect, the reason it works as an insecticide is because it destroys the internal organs of the insect. So why we didn't think that that was going to happen to us, I'm not quite sure, but this is why you can travel outside of the country and do better with grains in another country where things like that aren't allowed. So just, interesting fact for you. And then when it comes back to stress, one of the other things I wanted to address is your perspective on healing, because I saw some comments on like, out with the intestines, IV nutrients are better anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Not totally. Like, I'm
Yeah.
kind of a primal evolutionary doc. So like, I believe that our bodies are designed to heal and designed to function and designed to adapt. We just have to provide them the right support. So, and then he was talking about how you can have leaky gut after the age of like 30 or 40, and that's more likely.
Yep.
It's also when our hormones start to shift and we don't have the same hormone buffer that we had in our 20s. And so now our body just needs more care. It needs more TLC. It needs more rest. It needs more attention than it did when we were younger. So then it creates this funky thing of like your hormones start to lower, your gut gets more vulnerable. If you don't change your lifestyle, then you're probably going to get some leaky gut, which then goes back and affects your hormones. So I'm a big fan of addressing the gut before I ever even start to work on hormones, because a lot of the time, if I can correct the gut, the hormones will heal themselves. And then hormones go back to the stress component, because cortisol and your hormones involved in stress are on the same pathway as your sex hormones. So they're all related. And if you are cursing your intestines and you're angry at your illness and you feel like the universe is smiting you, that
Yes.
induces a stress response. So if your body is ill, I highly encourage you to be like, oh my gosh, this best friend that has been with me through every single hardship in my life, how can I serve you today? What do you need? Like, how can I love you better? That is a much more healing mindset to work with than being angry at the part of you that's injured. It's like being angry at a child that's injured. It just doesn't really work. You just have to love them. So same thing with your body. But I would love to dive a little bit more into the brain health component of like, okay, we've talked about how leaky gut happens. Now we can have like these lipopolysaccharides and other cytotoxic chemicals in our bloodstream that make our immune system upregulate. And then all of a sudden our immune system's just on high alert, and then all of these inflammatory chemicals start to go to our brain, and then that can affect us in the short term and in the long
Yeah,
term.
absolutely. So, and again, all of this is really driving inflammation, both starting in the gut, but then also in the periphery, right? So, and the big driver of inflammation and toxicity in the periphery is that tryptophan dysregulation that I talked about, where your central nervous system and your gut is actually trying to make melatonin and serotonin, but instead it's making this kynurenine and quinolinic acid. It's making these neurotoxic compounds because it's shifted in its biochemistry. So it's really about how, number one, how do you shift it back, and how do you stop the leakiness in the gut. And I think you bring up a really interesting thing about how you visualize your relationship with your intestines, right? And your intestines, the organ part of it is all you. The microbes are an ecosystem within your intestines that are really important, that are counting on you to nurture them the proper way, right? So if you think about your relationship with your gut, and when I say gut, I mean your microbes, right? So talking about the ecosystem in there, your microbiome is absolutely needed for you to survive, right? So if we removed your microbiome tomorrow, you could be exposed to a single cold virus and it would take you out in a matter of a couple of days, right? Your immune system would cease to actually function without your microbiome. And they've done these studies before in animal models where they remove the microbiome from an animal, they infect it with a very simple virus that any animal can handle, and that animal's dead in 2 days because the immune system does not respond to it. Also, keep in mind that your microbiome, your intestinal microbes, make over 50% of all the metabolic products that you need to function as a human. We don't have enough genetic elements to code for all of the things that we need to function at a human, all the way down to the cellular level, right? So our microbiome is our friend. Now, the thing is, there's a spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum, the microbiome is causing a lot of havoc in disease processes. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it is protecting you, doing the most amazing things for you, making you a superhuman, right? And we all exist somewhere in the spectrum. And your outcomes are going to be based on how much more you lean towards this side versus that side, right? So that's how you have to think about it. And then what are the behaviors you need to do in order to push your microbiome more towards this side versus that side, right? most of what we do in the modern Western world, especially in North America, pushes your microbiome that way, because we've not considered the microbiome in almost any decisions we've ever made when it comes to pharmaceuticals, foods, chemicals, all of those things, right? So we're exposed to something like 70, 80,000 chemicals a day, right? In just everything that we do, our personal care products, our homes and all that. 1,800 of those chemicals at least are type 1 carcinogens, right? And none of those chemicals, none of those 80,000 have ever been studied for what their impact is on the microbes in your system, right? And this is where the glyphosate conversation comes in. The glyphosate, the reason why they presumed it was safe was because glyphosate attacks a pathway called the shikimate pathway. That's the ability of the organism to make amino acids and so on, right? And insects and lower order animals have that shikimate pathway. And so the glyphosate becomes extremely poisonous to them and they die. They can't function metabolically. Their organs inside internally basically shut down. And they go, well, the humans don't have the shikimate pathway. We use other pathways to make amino acids, so it must be safe for us. But what they forgot and what they didn't realize at that time was that all of the microbes in our system use the shikimate pathway as well, right? And the microbes make up more than 50% of all our metabolic byproducts. So by exposing ourselves to this thing called glyphosate, we're shutting down or affecting at least half of all our metabolic capability, right? Hence, it leads to disease and dysfunction. And so when you think about that, right, we are the stewards of this amazing ecosystem that we have inside our body. This ecosystem is what is responsible for moving us up the evolutionary ladder and moving us up the food chain. And our ancestors over the last several 100,000 years have gone through hell and back to obtain and preserve this ecosystem that they've passed down to us, right? And the biggest disservice we are doing to humanity is that we are passing fewer and fewer organisms on to our next generations, right? And that's the scary part of it. We are driving a massive amount of extinction within our microbial system. And we're not passing down an adequate amount of microbes to the next generation. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to be good stewards of this ecosystem that has been passed down to us, which is why we exist today, right? If it wasn't for that ecosystem, we wouldn't exist today. And so we have to champion that and ensure our kids and our kids beyond that have really, really robust ecosystems to protect them, right? And we now know, we see, as we diminish our microbes, as we reduce our diversity, and we pass on this dismantle group of organisms, kids are being born with higher and higher rates of things that are associated with a dismantled microbiome. Think about spectrum disorders, right? Lots of studies connecting them to dysfunctional microbiomes during gestation and during birth. Think about immunological problems. I mean, asthma is basically an epidemic among kids these days, right? Allergies, food sensitivities, diabetes, skin disorders, all of these things, all are directly not only correlative, but causatively shown to be associated with a diminished microbiome, right? And it's our choices today that convey that, whether or not we are going to pass on a diminished microbiome or a robust microbiome. So think about it from that perspective, and hopefully it'll help you become good friends with your microbes, right? Let's go back to your original question about the gut brain and how these diminished microbes actually cause that. So now you have leaky gut. You have things leaking through. One of the key things, and Christine, you had mentioned this a few times, LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It is an endotoxin, and the reason it's called an endotoxin is because it's made inside our body. It's not a toxin that's coming in from the outside, so we can't get away from it. It's constantly there. About 50% of the microbes in your gut make this toxin all the time. And when it's in the cell, it's not really a toxin. It's fine. The cell uses it for lots of different things. When I say the cell, I mean the microbial cell. But when that microbial cell dies and bursts open, that toxin is allowed to float around on its own. If your gut is leaky, it's going to leak through the lining and end up in circulation. When it's in circulation, your body treats it very seriously because it is a toxin. And your immune system ramps up inflammatory responses wherever it sees this toxin. Now, this toxin is a fatty acid, so it looks a lot like the layer of your cell membrane. So it can get into almost anywhere in your body. One of the places it really likes to go is your brain, right? And so it goes through circulation or through your lymphatic system or even through your neurological system, up your vagus nerve, through your central nervous system into your brain. Once it lodges into the brain, it elicits a pretty profound inflammatory response, which creates inflammation in the brain. That inflammation is associated with upregulating HPA activation. Because one of the things that can trigger HPA activation, which is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that's the axis that gets activated when you're in the fight or flight response, right? So if you're walking through the woods and you see something rustling in the leaves and you trigger the flight or fight response to survive, that's your HPA axis coming alive, right? But nowadays we're triggering it with all kinds of things, with tweets and traffic and emails and things like you mentioned, right? The same survival mechanisms that have kept us alive as a species is being triggered all the time as if we're actually in danger. But that HPA axis is triggered through an inflammatory response. So that elevated inflammation in the central nervous system activates the hypothalamus to produce a series of hormones, which eventually leads to the release of cortisol. And then that also really increases the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine to get your body ready to fight or flee, right? All of these times you're going into this fight or flight response. And basically what's happening is when you're in a fight or flight response, your sympathetic nervous system is using your immune system to try to get more blood to your brain or your heart and your muscles. And the way it's doing that is it's releasing compounds that irritate your immune system in your brain, in your heart, and in your muscles to increase perfusion or inflammation in these areas of your body, right? And it's shutting down digestion. It's shutting down absorption. It's down regulating the immune system because now you're energy balancing, right? Your body is saying, hey, you've got to fight or flee from whatever this danger is. So we need to concentrate functionality in your brain, your heart, and your muscles so you can fight or run away. And we have no time to digest. We have no time to repair things. We have no time to break down food, right? We're not doing any of that stuff right now. We just have to survive. The big problem that we have in the modern age is that we're in that state most of the day. And that's not a good state to be in, right? So our ancestors can go through that cycle. They can go through a fight or flight response. If they see a predator or something that's a true danger, they can run away or fight for survival. And the moment the danger is gone, they can come down from it. And then you go back into the rest, digest, repair phase, right? When we go up in that cycle, because of the constant inflammation from leakiness in the gut, we stay in that elevated fight or flight state for most of the day. Then we start to develop this kind of basal level of anxiousness, right? We're constantly on guard. We're constantly in this fight or fight response. That also means you can't sleep at night because when you're in that state, you're not supposed to be able to sleep, right? When you sleep is when you repair a lot of these things. And because we're not sleeping, we're not repairing the inflammatory damage to the brain or to the heart or to the muscles and other areas. So over time, we end up with this net damage that becomes really hard to recover from if you let it go for too long, right? And here's one of the scariest things. When I started really working on the gut-brain axis and working with these researchers at the APC, I'm starting to look at all the pathologies. One of the scariest realizations I had from this was that what we experience today as anxiety or depression or sleeplessness or mood disorders is actually pre-Alzheimer's or pre-dementia, right? Because it's the same exact pathway that leads to the long-term neurodegeneration, which causes inflammatory induced stress response, right? Same exact pathways. It's just that at some point, the damage to your central nervous system and your brain becomes so profound that you start seeing the Alzheimer's dementia-like symptomologies coming on board. But that damage is occurring every time we induce a stress response the way we do, right? And so putting all of that together, at the end of the day, what we're really looking at is negating the leakiness in the gut, right? How do you repair that? What do you have to do to ensure that you have more microbes that rebuild that mucus layer, cinch up the tight junctions, have better diversity, and then how do you also negate the central nervous system inflammation that most people tend to experience, which leads to anxiety, depression, and then all these long-term neurological damages, right? And then keep in mind, because you're in that sympathetic state, you're not breaking down food, you're not digesting properly, so you start getting all these gut symptoms as well, right? You start bloating, you start, having constipation, all of those things, right? Those all kind of add in together with it as well.
Well, and some people, like,
Hmm.
it doesn't even show up as gut symptoms first. And I remember, like, this was something that I had to figure out for myself early on because
Hmm.
it just showed up as like anxiety for me. And everyone kept trying to like treat anxiety, and no one talked to me about like eating soda and bagels and like
Hmm.
nacho cheese because I was a teenager, right? And we just, we didn't know back then what we know now, or at least it wasn't as prevalent. And like my family tried their best, but we're going to talk, like I saw questions about like, how do we resolve this? That's scary. And it's like, yeah, it is a little bit scary, but also it's
Yep.
really important for how we perceive this stuff, right? We don't perceive it as this unbeatable thing. It's like we're providing you education right now so that you can take care of yourself. And a lot of what I do on my channel is I
Yep.
re-educate people on what they think of as an injury. Most people just think of like an ankle sprain, but no, like your gut can get injured. And if you go through like an emotionally tumultuous time, say like you lost your home or lost your job or lost a loved one or
Oh
something
yeah.
like that, grief is a huge instigator of leaky gut, and people don't realize this. And then we tend to get in this weird pathway where we're like sad and unhappy, so we're eating our comfort foods, and then that's usually foods that aren't too great for us, and then it like perpetuates the leaky gut stuff. So what we're telling you right now is how to identify this stuff and how to be aware of it, so that if you have something like that happen in your life, you can be like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed out right now. And then like, because I'm stressed, my ligaments got a little bit more flexible, and then I just sprained my ankle and I just like tweaked my shoulder at the gym. Okay, I need to like rest. I need to take it easy. I need to meditate more and like get my stress cascade and my mental perspective on the world under control a little bit. And then I need to eat food correctly, and I need to nourish myself in whatever form that comes. And basically everything I just described is a really good way to nourish, but nourishment also means like taking a break from the 8 million things we have to do. And I saw someone earlier saying like, well,
Hmm.
what if your relationships are causing you stress? Might be a
Yep.
time to spend time with some other people and get some more nourishment in your life that way. So we're going to kind of address the ways that you can work on this, but there are like specific orders to do it in that works better than others. And that kind of goes
Yep.
back to what we were talking about in the beginning. And I also, you had mentioned something in the Microbes and Mental Health Summit that I thought was super interesting. So as we go into like talking more about brain health, because the injury cascade that I was bringing up, like all of those different injuries,
Hmm.
they all contribute to the same pathway. It's all the same chemistry. But you had mentioned in the Microbes and Mental Health Summit that LPS actually prevents your receptors for
Yep.
serotonin and dopamine from working. And that was a new fact for me. Like I knew it affected the production because of the whole stress pathway. And if you're stressed out, it actually steals from your dopamine, which is why when you're stressed, you're unmotivated and undisciplined and not happy. And but I didn't know the thing about the
Yeah,
receptors,
yeah, and
so
this
I'd
this
love to talk
LPS
about that.
is so pervasive. It's so pesky. As I mentioned, it looks a lot like the lipid bilayers of your own cells, so it can get into almost any kind of tissue. And one of the areas that it does get into and binds is your serotonin receptors and your dopamine receptors as well in your brain and central nervous system, which means that even if you are producing enough, even if you're relatively healthy and your system is producing enough of those types of chemistries, you can't utilize them because the receptors are bound up by the presence of LPS. And then on top of that, it's eliciting this inflammatory response, which further exasperates it and turns on the HPA axis, and then also drives more leaky gut, and the cycle continues. So it's like a triple whammy to your system, right? Because not only is it activating your stress response, it's blocking the receptor sites that you need open in order to alleviate the stress response. And then the last part of it is it's actually negating the repair of the damaged system that's getting damaged from all of this inflammatory stress response as well. And I think, one of the things you just mentioned, I think is super important for people to think about is that number one, we're never going to have a life free of stress, right? We know that. That's just not feasible. So we're going to have stress, but it's really about managing the stress from a outside perspective, right? So that's the mindfulness work you're talking about, adjusting things in your life. If relationships are driving it, maybe there's a consideration of removing yourself from those relationships and so on. And then there's the internal stuff that you can do as well to help manage some of the pathologies that are being worked here, right? And
Yeah.
fortunately for us, as it turns out, biology and nature has been extremely kind in giving us specific microbes that really arrest a lot of these dysfunctional pathologies. It doesn't mean that it's a magic bullet. It doesn't mean that it by itself is going to fix everything. But it's an important part of the recipe if you take a look at your overall approach, right? So that's where these psychobiotics come from that are so exciting to see, right? And I mentioned earlier that the big question you have to ask is, are my probiotics silent or are they loud? A loud probiotic is good if you're perfectly healthy and you're just trying to upregulate your immune response, protect yourself from viral infections and so on. That's totally fine. But a loud probiotic is not good if you're under stress, if you already have inflammatory conditions, leaky gut, and so on. So having a silent probiotic that actually does the opposite, where it brings down the inflammation, is going to be a critical part. So the APC started working on this idea of a psychobiotic, about 15 years ago, right? And what they did is that, because it's based in Cork, Ireland, which is a very serene place, by the way. If any of you haven't been there, it's so green and lush. And yes, it rains a lot and it's a little overcast, but then when you see these happy sheep running around and people dancing the jig and having pints of Guinness, it just seems like a very happy place. And so what they did is they took a number of donors. Most of them were elderly women who had a history of just having really strong mental fortitude. Right? They never responded. They did stress tests on them, mental stress tests. They responded extremely well on it. They slept 7-8 hours a night almost their whole life. So they looked at these individuals and they actually took biopsies of their mucosa in their small and large bowel, right? Rather than fecal samples. And this is an important distinction. The reason for that is when you take biopsies of the mucosa, you find true commensals that are allowed to actually live deeper in that mucus layer that I'm talking about, right? A lot of the microbes that are coming out in your fecal sample are microbes that are living on this very top part. Many of them could be microbes that came in to the system through food or something else, and they're just coming back out in the fecal system, right? And a lot of those microbes can induce an inflammatory-like response, which again is fine for a healthy individual, but you want microbes that are quiet, that bring down the inflammatory response, that are truly commensal. And what they found is these truly commensal organisms that live a little bit deeper in the mucosa have a very unique structure to them. They have this thing called an exopolysaccharide. So it's this carbohydrate polysaccharide, but when you look in an electron micrograph, it looks like they have a million little arms all over themselves, right? It's a beautiful little structure. And then also in their membrane, they have something called a peptidoglycan, which is a very unique carbohydrate structure that certain microbes make, right? So then they said, okay, this is a very unique structure for a microbe. It seems like this is the important structure that's required to live a little bit deeper in the mucosa. They basically blended in with the mucosal lining. Then they started testing the microbes, and they saw that any of the bifidos that did not have this exopolysaccharide had an inflammatory response in the body. The microbes that do have this exopolysaccharide, not only do they not have an inflammatory response, they have an anti-inflammatory response. And one of the beautiful pathologies, and this is why the body's so fascinating, right? So when you have this microbe, or you take it as a probiotic, it comes in and it starts engaging with a part of your small intestine called the Peyer's patches, which is on the terminal end of your ileum. And which is a huge area of immune sampling and all that, right? That's a big area where immune decisions are made in your body. So this microbe comes in, it starts integrating with the Peyer's patches, that lining, that part of the lining of your gut. Through the Peyer's patch and through the lining of the intestines comes your dendritic cells. These big dendritic cells will come and actually swallow this entire probiotic bacteria and bring it across into circulation, right? Now, normally when a dendritic cell, which is one of your early acting immune cells, swallows something like a bacteria or virus, it induces a massive inflammatory response to try to alert the rest of your immune system. In this case, it does no inflammatory response. It swallows this bacteria, and in fact, on the inside of the dendritic cell, it digests this bacteria. And it digests all the carbohydrates that are on the lining and this exopolysaccharide. And then the dendritic cell spits out this peptidoglycan that this bacteria has within its cell membrane. Peptidoglycan, as it turns out, is a key element to reducing neurological inflammation. It brings down all of the inflammatory pathways we talked about, right? It negates LPS endotoxemia. So when you take an animal and you inject it with LPS into circulation, that's the most profound way of inducing a systemic leaky gut response in this animal. If you've dosed it with exopolysaccharide-rich probiotic bacteria, there's almost no inflammatory response at all, even though you put LPS directly in circulation, right? That's the mind-boggling thing about how all of this works. And so it also shifts tryptophan metabolism from that kynurenine quinolinic acid back to serotonin and melatonin. So the moment you start exposing yourself to this exopolysaccharide-rich probiotic bacteria, your dendritic cells start sending out peptidoglycan and other bacterial carbohydrates into your system. You get this amazing dampening of all the inflammatory responses, all of the inflammatory responses associated with leakiness in the gut, and all of the neurological inflammation that's associated with stress, anxiety response, depression, and so on, and also the stuff that negates sleep, right? So we have 8 published studies on the the mood strain. The other strain, it's called Bifidobacterium 35624. It's a longum, Bifidobacterium longum 35624. It's been studied for IBS. It's the most well-studied probiotic in the world. It has 85 published studies on it, right? And IBS, remember, is a neurological problem as well. So the same pathology occurs in IBS as it does in anxiety and stress. This is why 52% of IBS patients have confirmed diagnosis of anxiety compared to non-IBS individuals where it's like 18%, right? So if you have IBS, you have 2.5 times more likelihood to have anxiety because it's the same exact pathologies. So this is where microbes and biology become so elegant and beautiful because this solution is there, right? You just have to be able to invest in and be able to look for it and study it properly to be able to understand how it all works.
That was awesome. So basically, if I were to translate that a little bit for people, if you take the right strains of probiotics, they donate pieces of their body to our immune system that calm down other dysregulated bacteria
That's
that
exactly
cause
right.
an inflammatory response. So that's, yeah, that's like super profound research. I'm so glad that this is going on. And I've seen some questions come in about like, well, how do you know when is the right time for certain probiotics? And I also like, I know we have about 5 minutes left and you're a busy guy and I want to respect your time. Like, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. So I want to kind of end with like how people can approach things and what they can do and like the right order of approaching things in general. I will also say to you guys, this is not medical advice. This is education only. So please consult your practitioner. However, if we were to talk about the physiology of the gut and like ways that people can kind of slowly start to heal their lining, because I know you work with the probiotics that you're talking about, and then also like spore probiotics, and then there's probiotics that have prebiotics in them. And then there's also some that focus on healing the mucosal lining. So I'll just start off like for myself, if I have someone super sensitive, I don't even start them with probiotics first thing. I'll be like, hey, can you please incorporate some bone broth into your diet? That we can start getting like glutamine and zinc carnosine and other healing nutrients to the gut when you're already having a hard time absorbing. The other reason that I kept bringing up mindfulness is like 2 things. One, it starts to stimulate the healing systems of your body, because if you're in a stressed out state, you can't actually absorb nutrients. So I'm going to have you start to de-stress yourself as naturally as possible. And 2, they've also shown in studies that like with monks that are eating the same diet as other people, the meditation alone actually changes the organization of the microbiome. So you already start to affect the microbiome with those components. So that's like step 0, right? And then starting to bring in some nutrients, and then I'll let you kind of give your 2 cents on like the order of things that you like to approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things is starting to eliminate the things that are bad for the gut, right? So that's number 1, because then you're just going to keep exasperating the system in a way that's not good for it. So, reducing the processed foods and the things that are rich in glyphosate and so on, and trying to go as organic as you can, going as clean as you can, based on what your surroundings and your income level and all allow. So, but any effort in that in that approach is going to be beneficial. So that's number one. And number two, if you are ultra sensitive, immunoglobulins can be really effective for some people to reduce the inflammatory toxicity that occurs in the gut lining in those individuals. Especially, we tend to have very high levels of pathobionts. These are the opportunistic organisms. Other things like looking at antioxidants and antioxidant things that upregulate glutathione and so on, that can reduce some of the oxidative stress and inflammation that's going on in the system. That can help as well. We introduced the spore-based probiotics because what we saw, one of the key things with spores, in our case megaspore, is that the spores that we isolated, which are true human commensal organisms, are also silent, which is key, right? And that's the thing. We've tested those inside and out, and we show that they don't induce this inflammatory response. And so and what they do induce is a reproduction of that mucus layer, and they do increase the expression of tight junction proteins. So the spores are designed to be able to repair those systems. And in part, we have outsourced that kind of repair mechanism to these organisms, right? Because generally in nature, we're supposed to be eating these organisms on a regular basis, right? Mother Nature didn't foresee that we would divorce ourselves from these organisms, right? So over the course of time, we've come to be in this beautiful symbiotic relationship where we outsource that kind of functionality to microbes in our surrounding because we don't have enough genetic elements to do all of that ourselves, right? This is an interesting factor that humans have about 22,000 functional genes. And that might sound like a lot, but an earthworm has about the same amount, right? So we're not that sophisticated. We do have to outsource activity to microbes. And so the spores we found do that quite a bit. So we always have people starting with the megaspore to help with the lining of the gut. If they're very sensitive, we taper them up very slowly because there can be some die-off response and so on in a percentage of people. And we add in some immunoglobulins on top of that to dampen some of the die-off response. We also really love polyphenols and prebiotics, oligosaccharide prebiotics, because the microbes that rebuild that mucosa, I kept talking about the balance between microbes that eat away the mucosa and rebuild it. The microbes that rebuild it tend to love prebiotics. They tend to love things like oligosaccharides, right? Which they then convert into short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is what a key thing that rebuilds this mucosal lining. So we go with this spore-based probiotic, the prebiotic, and the polyphenol with IgG mix. For us, we put it in a kit called the Total Gut Restoration Kit. The idea behind the kit is about revamping the microbiome and the lining of the gut. But from day one, you can absolutely start with the psychobiotics, the high exopolysaccharide rich strains. That's in our product called Zenbiome. We have Cope and Sleep. It's formulated a little bit differently, whether you're having daytime, stress, mood disorders, or nighttime sleep, or both, you would take one of each. But getting these exopolysaccharide rich bifidobacteria is a critical thing. The research coming out on these microbes are just absolutely mind-boggling in terms of what they do in our system, and they're so unique. When you look at people that live a really long life, right? So when you look at centenarians and all that, they tend to have really high levels of these types of bifidobacteria because it really helps manage the inflammatory responses in their body. So to summarize that, right? So number one, reduce the things that induce leaky gut, right? Which we talked a lot about that, and hopefully you'll be able to take notes from re-listening to this discussion. Number two is starting to increase things like diversity of your food, adding in the mindfulness behavior, managing the sources of stress in your life, right? And there's many ways of doing that, and whatever little you do with that is still important and beneficial, right? So one of the things that I think people feel defeated about is that they can't make drastic changes in their life, whether it's in the relationship or work and things like that. That's fine, right? Small victories will all add up in this case, right? So like give yourself a daily victory. And it may be just how you perceive the stress that you're experiencing, right? It may be just, ignoring a message rather than diving into it, right? It may be just staying off of certain aspects of social media that might stress you out for a day. Small victories will make a big difference over time, right? Because it's really small damages over time that led to the big problems that you're experiencing. And then, of course, you can use the spore-based probiotics or the total gut restoration system, and then get these exopolysaccharide psychobiotics in. They make all the difference in individuals.
That was perfect. Thank you. And if you guys decide that you want to try some of these things, I will say, like, please consult your provider. It's really beneficial and important to have a third party to go through this with you, to kind of observe your body from the outside and make sure that nothing's getting pushed too quickly. And as he said, like, it's a lot of small things that lead up to this. So it's usually like a small and slow, steady increase on the way out of it. So it's not like you can just like dose all the probiotics and think that that is the solution. It's like he said, it's part of a recipe, and that recipe also goes with lifestyle and other things that you're doing. So just know that it's a process, and it's very much about listening to your body. So if you ever start experimenting with any of these things, and then you start having some like different symptoms, or you're uncomfortable, that's your body speaking to you. Like, listen to it and slow down what you're doing and back off and maybe change it a little bit and consult your provider. And if you are working with a provider and you have a weird thing pop up, talk to them about it. And if they dismiss it, talk to a different one and like see if you can get a second opinion, because it is important to listen to your body, because everyone is unique and everybody is different. And we are talking about generalizations and giving you physiology education, but it's important to take into account your individuality and your personal needs based on where your body is at, which brings us all the way back to the beginning of what we were talking about. And I'll go ahead and put a link on my page that I have in my bio towards some of the stuff that you guys can go check out, so that you can easily find it. I always just like seeing how the conversation goes, and then I can customize those little things for you. But if anyone ever had any questions, or they wanted to learn more,
come to our page, microbiomelabs.com. We have a lot of resources on there. But another site that we have been building, and it's been built out, and we keep populating it with relevant information, is called Better Biome. So it's betterbiome.com. And the whole idea behind it is just about having a platform for education. We've got a number of clinicians on there who are experts in different areas, and they post articles and videos and all that. We also post a lot of research on there. We can do it free of, potential regulatory issues, because we don't have any products on there. There's no sales that occur on that website. It's purely for education. So that's called betterbiome.com, and we'll continue to populate that so that you can go in there, search any kind of information, and find good resources. And it's all just completely objective resources on there.
Thank you. That's awesome. And, for anybody listening, he and I were actually talking a little bit before this about like what we wanted to discuss. And there's a lot of people out there that have been struggling with like long-term symptoms from certain conditions that we have all dealt with over the last few years, but they're really hard to talk about on social platforms. So that would be a place where you could probably go learn a lot more about some of the things that you can do for some of those long-term symptoms from environmental exposures. So Kiran, thank you so much. This was awesome. I look forward to the next time we get to chat at some point. And always such a pleasure.
Well,
and,
it's my pleasure. And thank you so much for doing what you do by providing a platform to, empower people with knowledge. All the work the researchers and all that in the world do would mean nothing if you couldn't convey this information to people. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for providing a channel, a conduit that the research world can use to educate it and empower people. So it's always a pleasure being on, and I do look forward to next time. Thank you.
That's great. Well, have a wonderful